Hey there, folks. Welcome back to the third episode of this web development basics tutorial. Last episode, we learned the basics of CSS and use it to add some color and styling to our HTML. In this episode, I'm going to talk about a CSS layout model called Flexbox. If you haven't seen the first two episodes in this series, then go and watch them. But if you're just here to learn a little bit about Flexbox, then you can find the starting code on GitHub. There's a link in the description to the GitHub code for this episode, but you can just go back a folder to episode 2 and find the starting code there. Flexbox is something that we can use to arrange items vertically and horizontally inside of a container in a way that is responsive to the size of the viewport. So, for example, right now, these paragraph elements and this H3 element are all items inside of this div, which is the container, and they're currently laid out vertically, aligned to the left, and the only spacing is from the margins and padding. With Flexbox, we can easily adjust all of those things. It might seem a bit complex at first, but it's really quite simple once you get used to it. Personally, I use Flexbox a lot, and I'll also be using it for the final project, so I wanted to give it its own video. There are plenty of cheat sheets that you can find online showing the various properties and values involved with Flexbox, so I'll leave a link in the description to one that I like to use. So to set this up, I'm going to start by making a few changes to our HTML. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add 3 new divs using the card class around our other HTML examples here. So one for the links, do one for the image, and then one for the form. And we'll move those closing tags. Then I'm going to add one more div around all 6 of these cards. So we'll open it right up here, just before the paragraphs card. And then we'll take that closing tag and put it all the way down at the bottom, just below the forms card. And then up here in the opening tag, I'm going to give it the class of container. So a neat trick that's built into VS Code, if you right-click the page and select Format Document, you'll see that it cleans up the code a bit and properly indents the HTML for us. So that makes things a little easier. Now let's go over to our CSS file, and I'm going to add the container class selector to the rule for our cards. And then finally, I'm going to remove the margin bottom and the width. So now on our web page, we see that there are 3 new boxes around the links, image, and forms HTML examples, and then all 6 of our cards are sat inside of another box with that gray border and white smoke background. So we're going to need to make our container div a flex container, and we can do that by adding a new CSS rule on just the container class and setting the display property to flex. So now we can see that the 6 cards are all arranged horizontally and they no longer span the entire width of the page. They're all varying widths based on the content inside. And this is because our card divs, which are all children of the container div, are now considered to be flex items. They are also arranged in the default flex direction of row. So if we wanted, we could set the flex direction property in our container rule to column. And now we'll see that the flex items are once again arranged vertically and taking up as much width as they can. A couple of other flex direction values to make note of are column reverse and row reverse, which I'll show you here. These are the same direction as column and row, just reversed. So now the flex items are arranged in a reverse order and they are aligned to the right side of the container instead of the left. For now, we will just use the default value of row. All right, so let's say that we wanted to give the cards a specified width again. So we can just go with a width value of 400 pixels. Well, now we can see that all 6 cards look to be the same width. However, they're all a little bit smaller than 400 pixels. In fact, they only look to be about 311 pixels wide. Well, for all 6 cards to be 400 pixels wide, that needs 2400 pixels of width, which the container, let alone my monitor, does not have. So what we can do is use the flex wrap property. And we will set it to the value of wrap. Now we see that the flex items are the full width of 400 pixels, and they wrap to a new row at the point where the collective width of the items would have exceeded the width of the container. So now that we have our flex items arranged in the way we want, how can we center the items or add some space between the cards or something like that? Well, the first property that we can use for this is the justify content property. And to start, I'll set this to center. And now we can see that the flex items are nice and neatly centered within their container. Now, justify content is going to apply to the main flex axis, and because we have our flex direction set to row, this means our main axis is horizontal, or the x-axis. If the flex direction were set to column or column reverse, the main axis would be vertical, or the y-axis. Justified content has a few other useful values to note, one of which is space between. And now we'll see that there's some, space between each of our cards. The first and last flex item in each row are flush with the left and right sides of the container, though keep in mind we still have that 16 pixel padding. And then we could also use space around. And what this is doing is adding an equal amount of space around each flex item, or at least on the left and right sides. So as a result, the amount of space between two flex items is twice as much as the space between a flex item and the sides of the container. If we wanted to have an equal amount of space between each flex item and the sides of the container, we would use space evenly. So the difference is subtle in this example, but now the distance between the left padding of the container and the first flex item in each row is the same as the distance between the first and second flex items. Finally, we can use the values flex start or flex end to justify the items along the left or right sides of the container. So that's how we can justify our items on the main axis, but what about the cross axis? Well, before we do that, we need to give the container a bit of extra height. So let's set this to 80 view height. So now the container itself is a bit taller, and then the flex items inside have also stretched a little bit vertically to fit the new height. And to adjust this behavior and align our items along the cross axis, we will use the align items property. And to start, again, we'll set this to center. Now we can see that the flex items have varying heights based on their content and are all aligned on the same center line for each row. With align items, we can also use the flex start and flex end properties, just like with justified content, and this will align the items along the top or bottom of each row. Now, because we are using flex wrap and our items are wrapping onto a second line, we can also use the align content property. So I'll just change align items to align content to avoid overlap for now, and leave it set to center. So in using this property instead of align items, the cards are now a consistent height across each row, and it's now the collective two rows that are being centered within the container. This property works about the same as justified content, and it can use all of the same values like space between, space around, space evenly. It just affects the rows of the wrapped flex items along the cross axis rather than the individual items in each row. If we were not using the flex wrap property, or there weren't enough flex items to wrap to a second line, this property would essentially have no effect. So, if there's both align and justified content, then surely there must also be both align and justify items. Well, there is, but funnily enough, justify items does nothing with Flexbox, so we're just going to ignore it. All right, so far, we've been looking at a lot of properties that we can set on our Flex container. So let's shift gears a little bit and look at a few properties that we can assign to our Flex items. Before we do, I want to do a bit of setup to make things a bit easier to visualize. I'm going to start by splitting the container div in two. So back in our HTML, I'm going to add a new closing div tag here underneath the unordered list. And then right below that, I'm going to add a new opening div tag with the class of container. And we can remove the closing div tag that VS Code automatically adds for us, since we already have a closing div tag down here below the forms card. Now we can see that we have two containers on the web page, each of them with 3 cards in it. And then in the CSS, let's go ahead and remove the height so that we can see them both on the page without scrolling. And then we'll remove the width on the cards. Then I'll go ahead and remove the flex wrap and align content properties as they are no longer needed. Excellent, that looks good. I just wanted to avoid any confusing overlap between the properties I'm about to show you and the ones I've already talked about. So the first flex item property we're going to look at is flex grow, which I will set on the cards class, and we'll give it the value of 1. So now we see that the flex items have all stretched or grown along the main axis and collectively span the entire width available to them. Because they all have the same flex grow value of 1, they have all grown an equal amount. Something to note, though they've all grown an equal amount, they are not all the same width, and this is because they did not all start at the same width. The starting point is known as the flex basis, so we can give our cards all the same flex basis property, and we'll set this to something like 300 pixels. So now all of our flex items are the same exact width, because with these two properties, we're telling our cards to start at a width of 300 pixels and then all grow an equal amount until all available width in the container has been used. Not all of our flex items have to have the same flex grow value either. So let's add a new rule below the card class rule, and I'm going to use what's called a pseudo selector. And so this selector is going to select all of the elements with the card class, but only the first ones which are found within a given element. So because we have 2 container divs, each with 3 card div children, this will select the first one in each, being the paragraphs and links card. So in this rule, we will set the flex grow value to 3. And now we will see that the first cards in each container are much wider than the other 2. By setting the flex grow value to 3 while the others are set to 1, we're telling those first cards to grow 3 times as much as the others, starting from the flex basis of 300 pixels. On the other end of this, we also have the flex shrink property. This acts much the same as flex grow, but instead we're telling the flex items how they should shrink in order to fit their container if necessary. So let's swap out the flex grows for flex shrink. And then let's set the flex basis to something like 500 pixels. And on the web page, we can see that the flex items don't look to be shrinking, and they're all currently at a width of 500 pixels. And this is because the containers have plenty of room to hold all 3 of them, and they don't need to shrink. But if we open up the developer's tools and we go to responsive design mode, when we make our viewpoints smaller and the containers shrink to the point where there's not enough room for all 3 flex items to be 500 pixels, we see that the first cards here on the left shrink more than the other 2 as they all try to stay within the width of the containers. In fact, they're shrinking 3 times as much because their flex shrink property value is 3 times as much as the other 2. The flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis properties can also be set in a shorthand property, similar to how we set the border and padding using shorthand. And this property is simply flex. So I will set this to 1, 3, and 500 pixels. And then down here in the card first child rule, I'll set this to 3, 1, 500 pixels. So the values of the flex shorthand property are applied in the order of flex grow, flex shrink, and then flex basis. So in this setup, all of the cards start at a basis of 500 pixels, but the first child card elements will grow 3 times as much as the others and shrink 3 times as less. Essentially, no matter what the width of the parent is, the first cards will always try to be larger than the others. All right, so the next flex item property I'll show you is align self. And as you can probably tell by the name, this allows us to set the alignment of individual flex items. So if we give our containers a bit of height, and we'll go with 45 view height, and then we set the align items property to flex end. Well, right now we can see that the cards are sitting at the bottom of the containers, but we can go to the card first child rule and set align self to flex start. And now we'll see that the first card in each container is aligned to the top while the others remain along the bottom. Simple as that. Finally, I have one last property to show you, the order property. So we can set this on our flex items to specify the order we want them to appear within the container, even if the order in the HTML is laid out differently. By default, the order property value is set to 0 for all items. So if we give our first cards the order property and set it to 1, then we'll see that the first child cards now appear after the other two in their respective containers. So from left to right, the order values are 0, 0, 1. All right, so I have just gone over a bunch of different flex properties in a short amount of time. There is, of course, no expectation to know all of these properties right away or by heart. As I mentioned earlier, there are a ton of Flexbox cheat sheets online you can use as a reference, as well as other documentation resources such as the MDN Web Documentation or W3 Schools. Also, when I was first learning web development, my instructor showed me a pretty cool online game called Flexbox Froggy. It's a gamified way to practice common Flexbox properties where you have a pond with some lily pads that acts as the flex container, and then some frogs that are the flex items. You need to assign Flexbox properties to arrange the frogs so that they're all sitting on the correct lily pads. You can find links to everything I've just talked about in the description if you're interested, but that's going to do it for this episode. Please consider liking the video or subscribing if you've enjoyed. It really helps me out. Other than that, I will see you in the next one where we are going to start learning some JavaScript.